Chapter 26 of the Layton Court Mystery by Anthony Berkeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Erickson, Toronto. Chapter 26. Mr. Grierson Tries His Hand. For some moments Roger was incapable of speech. This disclosure was so totally unexpected, so entirely the reverse of anything that he had ever imagined, that at first it literally took his breath away. He could only stand and stare, as if his eyes were about to pop out of his head, at the two entirely unmoved persons who had sprung this overwhelming surprise upon him. "Is that what you wish to know?" Jefferson asked courteously, "or would you wish my wife to confirm it?" "Oh, no need at all," Roger gasped, doing his best to pull himself together. I should like to apologize to you for the apparent impertinence of my questions, and to congratulate you, if you will allow me to do so." "Very kind," Jefferson muttered. Lady Stanworth, or Lady Jefferson, as she was now, bowed slightly. "If you don't want me any more, Harry," she said to her husband, "there are one or two things I have to do." "Certainly," Jefferson said, opening the door for her. She passed out without another glance at Roger. "Look here, Jefferson," exclaimed the latter impulsively as soon as the door was closed again. "I know you must be thinking me the most appalling bounder, but you must believe that I shouldn't have tackled you in that way if I hadn't got very solid and serious reasons for doing so. As things have turned out, I can't tell you at present what those reasons are, but really it's something of the greatest possible importance." "Oh, that's all right, Sheringham," Jefferson returned with gruff amiability. "Guess you must have something up your sleeve. Bit awkward, though. Ladies and all that, you know," he added vaguely. "Beastly," Roger said sympathetically. "As a matter of fact, that's a development that had never occurred to me at all, you and Lady Stanworth being married. If anything, it makes things very much more complicated than before." "Bit of a mystery or something on hand, eh?" Jefferson asked with interest. "Very much so," Roger replied, gazing thoughtfully out of the window. "Connected with Stanworth and his activities, you understand," he added. "Ah," Jefferson observed comprehendingly. "Then I'd better not ask any questions. Don't want to learn anything more about that side of things. Seen too many poor devils going through it already." "No, but I tell you what," Roger said, wheeling suddenly about. "If you could answer a few more questions for me, I should be more than grateful. Only as a favor, of course, and if you refuse I shall understand perfectly. But you might be able to help me clear up a very tricky state of affairs." "If it's anything to do with helping somebody Stanworth got hold of, I'll answer questions all night," Jefferson replied with vigor. "Go ahead." "Thanks very much. Well then, in the first place, will you tell me some details regarding your wife's relations with Stanworth? It doesn't matter if you object, but I should be very glad if you could see your way to do so." "But I thought you said you knew that story." Roger did not think it necessary to explain that the lady to whom he had been referring was not Lady Jefferson. "Oh, I know most of it, I think," he said airily, "but I should like to hear it all from you if I could. I know that she was in Stanworth's power, of course," he added, making a shot in the twilight, "but I'm not quite clear as to the precise way." Jefferson shrugged his shoulders. "Oh, well, as you seem to know so much, you'd better have the whole thing straight. Stanworth nosed out something about her father. His brother was in love with her, and Stanworth gave her the option of marrying him or having her father shown up. He could have had the old Earl put in the dock, I believe. Naturally, she chose the brother, who, by the way, didn't know anything about Stanworth's activities, so I understand. Quite an amiable, rather weak sort of a fellow. And since then, of course, Stanworth had the whip hand over her?" Jefferson winced. "Yes," he said shortly. "Even after her father died, she wouldn't want the family shown up." "I see," said Roger thoughtfully. "So Lady Stanworth had little enough reason to love her brother-in-law, and since Jefferson fell in love with her, her cause would naturally become his." Truly he had motive and to spare for ridding the world of such a man. Yet, although Jefferson and his wife might easily have concocted the story of his whereabouts that night, Roger already felt just as convinced of the former's innocence as he was before of his guilt. The man's manner seemed somehow to preclude altogether the idea of subterfuge. Had he really killed Stanworth, Roger was sure that he would have said so by the time that matters had reached this length, bluntly and simply, just as he had told the story of his own downfall. But in spite of his convictions, Roger was not such a fool as not to put the obvious questions that occurred to him. "Why was your marriage secret?" he asked. "Did Stanworth know about it?" "No, he wouldn't have allowed it. It would have looked like a combination against him. He wanted us separate for his own ends." "Did you hear the shot that killed him?" Roger said suddenly. "No. About 2:00, wasn't it? I'd been asleep 2 hours. "You did sleep with your wife, then, in spite of the necessity of preserving secrecy?" "Her maid knew. Used to go back to my room in the early morning. Beastly hole-and-corner business, but no alternative." "And only Stanworth's death could have freed you, so to speak?" Roger mused. "Very opportune, wasn't it?" "Very," Jefferson replied laconically. "You think I forced him somehow to shoot himself, don't you?" "Well, I, Roger stammered, completely taken aback. Jefferson smiled grimly. "Knew you must have some comic idea in your head. Just seen what you've been driving at." "Well, you can rest assured I didn't, for the simple reason that nobody or no threats on earth could have made him do a thing like that. Why he did it, heaven only knows. Complete mystery to me. Can't fathom it. Thank God he did, though." "You don't think he might have been murdered?" Roger suggested tentatively. "Murdered? How could he have been? Out of the question under the circumstances. Besides, he took jolly good care of that. I'd have murdered him myself before this, hundreds of times, if I hadn't known it would make things worse than before, all round." "Yes, I've heard about that. Kept the evidence addressed to the interested parties, didn't he? I suppose everyone knew that?" "You bet they did. He rubbed it in. No, Stanworth never meant to be murdered. But my God, I had a fright when I saw him lying there dead and the safe locked." "You were going to try and open it when I interrupted you yesterday morning, of course." "Yes, properly caught out then," Jefferson smiled ruefully. "But even if I'd found the keys, I didn't know the combination. Lord, what a relief that note of his was. You know about that, I suppose?" "You got a note by the post before lunch, did you?" "That's right, saying he was going to kill himself. Rum business. Can't explain it. Almost too good to be true. I feel another man." "And so are a good many other people, I imagine," Roger said softly. "And women, too. His activities were fairly widespread, weren't they?" "Very, I believe. Never knew much about it, though. He kept all that sort of thing to himself." "That butler, now," Roger hazarded. "He looks a pretty tough customer. I suppose Stanworth employed him as a sort of bodyguard?" "Yes, something like that. But I don't know about employed." "What do you mean?" "He was no more employed than I was. That is to say, we got a salary and we did our work, but it wasn't a sort of employment either of us could leave." Roger whistled softly. "Oh-ho! So friend Graves was another victim, was he? What's his story?" "Don't know all the details, but Stanworth could have had that man hanged, I believe," Jefferson said coolly. "Instead, he preferred to use him as a sort of bodyguard, as you say." "I see. Then Graves hadn't much cause to love him either, I take it." "If he hadn't known what would happen afterwards, I wouldn't have given Stanworth 10 minutes of life in Graves's presence." Roger whistled again. "Well, thanks very much, Jefferson. I think that's all I wanted to know." "If you're trying to look for someone who induced Stanworth to shoot himself, you're wasting your time," Jefferson remarked. "Couldn't be done." "Oh, there's a little more in my quest than that," Roger smiled as he let himself out of the room. He hurried upstairs, glancing at his watch as he did so. The time was nearly 5 minutes to 4. He scurried down the passage to Alec's room. "Finished packing?" he asked, putting his head round the door. "Good. Well, come along to my room while I do mine." "Well?" Alec asked sarcastically when they were once more ensconced in Roger's bedroom. "Has Jefferson written out his confession?" Roger paused in the act of laying his suitcase on a chair. "Alec," he said solemnly, "I owe friend Jefferson an apology, though I can't very well tender it. I was hopelessly wrong about him, and you were hopelessly right. He didn't kill Stanworth at all. It's extremely annoying of him, considering how neatly I solved this little problem of ours, but there's the fact." "Humph," Alec observed. "I won't say I told you so, because I know how annoying it would be for you, but I don't mind telling you that I'm thinking it hard." "Yes, and the most irritating part is that you're fully entitled to do so," Roger said, throwing his pajamas into the case. "That's what I find so irksome." "But I suppose you've found somebody else to take his place all right?" "No, I haven't. Isn't it maddening? But I'll tell you one significant fact I've unearthed. That butler had as much cause as anyone, if not more, to regret the fact that Stanworth was still polluting the earth." "Had he? Oh, but look here, how do you know that Jefferson didn't do it?" Roger explained. "Not much, so far as actual hard and fast evidence goes, I'm afraid," he concluded. "But we greater detectives are above evidence. It's psychology that we study, and I feel in every single bone in my body that Jefferson was telling the truth." "Lady Stanworth," Alec commented. "Good Lord." "Some men are brave, aren't they? Still, I dare say she'll make an excellent wife. I believe that's the right thing to say on this sort of occasion. But seriously, Alec, I'm absolutely baffled again. I think I shall have to turn the case over to you." "Well, do," Alec retorted with unexpected energy, "and I'll tell you who killed Stanworth." Roger desisted from his efforts to close the lid of his bulging case in order to look up in surprise. "You will, eh? Well, who did?" "Some unknown victim of Stanworth's blackmail, of course. The whole thing stands to reason. We were looking for a mysterious stranger at first, weren't we? And we thought he might be a burglar. Translate the burglar into the blackmailer's victim, and there you are. And as he burnt the evidence himself, and we haven't the least idea who was on Stanworth's blackmailing list, we shall never find out who he was. The whole thing seems as clear as daylight to me." Roger turned to his refractory case again. "But why did we give up the burglar idea?" he asked. "Aren't you rather overlooking that? Chiefly because of the disappearance of those footprints. That must mean either that the murderer came from inside the house, or that he had an accomplice there." "I don't agree with you. We don't know how or why the footprints disappeared. It might have been pure chance. William might have raked the bed over, somebody might have noticed it and smoothed it out. There are plenty of possible explanations for that." With a heave, Roger succeeded in clicking the lock with which he was struggling. He straightened his bent back and drew his pipe out of his pocket. "I've talked enough for a bit," he announced. "Oh, rot!" Alec exclaimed incredulously. "And it's about time I put in a little thinking," Roger went on, disregarding the interruption. "You run along down to tea, Alexander. You're 10 minutes late as it is." "And what are you going to do?" "I'm going to spend my last 20 minutes here doing some high-speed cogitating in the back garden. Then I shall be ready to chat with you in the train." "Yes, I have a kind of idea that you'll be quite ready to do that," said Alec rudely as they went out into the passage. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Layton Court Mystery by Anthony Berkeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Erickson, Toronto. Chapter 27. Mr. Sheringham hits the mark. Roger did not reappear until the car was at the front door, and the other members of the party already making their farewells on the steps. His leave-taking was necessarily a little hurried, but perhaps this was not altogether without design. Roger did not feel at all inclined to linger in the society of Lady Jefferson. He shook hands warmly enough with her husband, however, and the manner of their parting was sufficient to assure the latter, without the necessity of any words being spoken on the subject, that his confidences would be regarded as inviolate. The taciturn Jefferson became almost effusive in return. Arrived at the station, Roger personally superintended the purchase of the tickets and deftly shepherded Mrs. Plant into a non-smoking carriage, explaining that the cigars which he and Alec proposed to smoke would spell disaster to the subtleties of parfum jasmine. A short but interesting conversation with the guard, followed by the exchange of certain pieces of silver, ensured the locking of the door of their own first-class smoker. "And so ends an extremely interesting little visit," Roger observed as soon as the train started, leaning back luxuriously in his corner and putting his feet on the seat. "Well, I shan't be sorry to get back to London, on the whole, I must say, although the country is all very well in its way. I always think you ought to take the country in small doses to appreciate it properly, don't you?" "No," said Alec. "Or look at it in comfort from the windows of a train," Roger went on, waving an appreciative hand towards the countryside through which they were passing. "Fields, woods, streams, barley—" "That isn't barley, it's wheat." "Barley, trees, delightful, my dear Alexander. But how much more delightful seen like this in one charming flash that leaves a picture printed on the brain only to give way the next instant to another equally charming one, than stuck down in the middle, for instance, of one of those fields of barley, with the prospect of a 10-mile walk in this blazing sunshine between you and the next long drink. Don't you agree?" "No." "I thought you wouldn't, but reflect. Sunshine, considered from the purely aesthetic point of view, is, I'm quite willing to grant you, a thing of—" "What are you talking about?" Alec asked despairingly. "Sunshine, Alexander," returned Roger blandly. "Well, for goodness sake, stop talking about sunshine. What I want to know is, have you got any farther?" Roger was evidently in one of his maddening moods. "What with?" he asked blankly. "The Stanworth affair, of course, you idiot!" shouted the exasperated Alec. "Ah, yes, of course, the Stanworth affair," Roger replied innocently. "Did I do that bit well, Alec?" he asked with a sudden change of tone. "What bit?" "When I said, 'What with?' Did I say it with an air of bland innocence? The best detectives always do, you know. When they reach this stage of the proceedings, they always pretend to have forgotten all about the case in hand. Why they do so I've never been able to imagine, but it's evidently the correct etiquette for the job. By the way, Alec," he added kindly, "you did your part very well. The idiot friend always shouts in an irritated and peevish way like that. I really think we make quite a model pair, don't you?" "Will you stop yapping and tell me whether you've got any farther with Stanworth's murder?" Alec demanded doggedly. "Oh, that?" said Roger with studied carelessness. "I solved that exactly 43 minutes ago." "What?" "I said that I solved the mystery exactly 43 minutes ago, and a few odd seconds, of course. It was an interesting little problem in its way, my dear Alexander Watson, but absurdly simple once one had grasped the really vital factor in the case. For some extraordinary reason I appeared to have overlooked it before, hence the delay. But don't put that bit in when you come to write up the case, or I shall never land the next vacancy for a stolen crown jewels recoverer to an influential emperor." "You've solved it, have you?" Alec growled skeptically. "I seem to have heard something like that before." "Meaning Jefferson? Yes, I admit I backed the wrong horse there. But this is a very different matter. I've really solved it this time." "Oh, well, let's hear it." "With the greatest pleasure," Roger responded heartily. "Let me see now. Where shall I begin? Well, I think I've told you all the really important things that I managed to elicit from Mrs. Plant and Jefferson, haven't I? Except one. Roger dropped his bantering manner with startling suddenness. Alec, he said seriously, that man Stanworth was as choice a scoundrel as I've ever heard of. What I didn't tell you is that he gave Mrs. Plant 3 months in which to find £250 for him, and hinted that if she hadn't got it already, a pretty woman like her would have no difficulty in laying her hands on it. Good God, Alec breathed. He even went farther than that, and offered to introduce her to a rich man out of whom she would be able to wheedle it if she played her cards properly. Oh, I tell you, shooting was much too easy a death for friend Stanworth. And the person who did it ought to be acclaimed as a public benefactor, instead of being hanged by a grateful country, as he certainly would be if all this had got into the hands of the police. You can hardly expect the law to recognize the principle of poetic justice for all that, Alec objected. I don't see why not, Roger retorted. However, we won't go into that at present. Well, to my mind, there were 2 chief difficulties in this Stanworth business. The first one was that at the beginning there didn't seem to be any definite motive for killing him, and afterwards, when we'd found out about him, there were far too many. All those people in the house, Mrs. Plant, Jefferson, Lady Stanworth, the butler, who, by the way, appears to be a murderer in a small way already, as I gather from Jefferson. That was the hold which Stanworth had over him. All of them had every reason to kill him, and the case began to take on the aspect not so much of proving who did it, but by a process of elimination, of finding out who didn't. In that way I managed eventually to dismiss Mrs. Plant, Jefferson, and Lady Stanworth. But besides the people actually under our noses in the house, there were all the others, goodness only knows how many of them, of whose very existence we knew nothing, all his other victims. Were there many of them, then? I understand that Stanworth's practice was a fairly extensive one, Roger replied ironically. Anyhow, I was able to narrow down the field to a certain extent. Then I began to go over once more the evidence we had collected. The question I kept asking myself was, is there a single item that gives a definite pointer towards any certain person, male or female? Female? Roger repeated surprisedly. Certainly. In spite of everything, the footprint in the flower bed, for example, I was still keeping before me the possibility of a woman being mixed up in it. It didn't seem altogether probable, but I couldn't afford to lose sight of the bare possibility. And it's lucky I did, for it was just that which finally put me on the right track. Good Lord! Yes, I admit I was slow in the uptake, for the fact had been staring me in the face the whole time, and I never spotted it. You see, the key to the whole mystery was that there was a second woman in the library that night. How on earth do you know that? Alec asked in consternation. By the hair we found on the settee. I put it away in the envelope, you remember, and promptly forgot all about it, assuming it to have been one of Mrs. Plant's. It struck me suddenly in the garden just now that it wasn't anything of the sort. Mrs. Plant's hair is very much darker. Of course, that opened up an entirely new field for speculation. Good Lord! Yes, it is rather surprising, isn't it? Roger continued equably. That set my brain galloping away like wildfire, I need hardly tell you, and 5 minutes later the whole thing became absolutely plain to me. I'm a little hazy about some of the details, of course, but the broad lines are clear enough. You mean you guessed who the second woman was? Hardly guessed. I knew at once who she must be. Who? Alec asked with unconcealed eagerness. Wait a bit, I'm coming to that. Well, then I began to put 2 and 2 together. I'd got a pretty shrewd idea already of the personal appearance of the man himself. Oh, it was a man, then? Yes, it was a man, right enough. There was never any doubt that a man must have done the actual killing. No woman would have been strong enough for the struggle that must have taken place. Stanworth was no weakling, so that gives us the fact that the man must have been a strong, burly sort of person. From the footprint and the length of those strides across the bed, he was evidently both tall and largely built. From the clever way in which everything was left, he must have been possessed of a fund of cunning. From the manner in which he left that window fastened behind him, it was clear that he was thoroughly accustomed to handling lattice windows. Well, what does all that give us? It looked obvious to me. Alec was staring intently at the speaker, following every word with eager attention. "I think I see what you're getting at," he said slowly. "I thought you would," said Roger cheerfully. "Of course, there were other things that clinched it. The disappearance of that footprint, for instance. That must have been done by somebody who knew what he was doing, and somebody who heard me say that I was going to fit every male boot in the house into the mark. You remember. Of course, it was that which made me so sure at first about Jefferson, because I jumped to the conclusion that it must have been Jefferson whom we saw edging out of the library door. After that, I more or less had Jefferson on the brain." "I did my best to put you off that track," said Alec with a slight smile. "Oh, you did. It wasn't your fault that I clung to him so persistently." "I tried hard to stop you putting your foot in it, if you remember." "I know, and I dare say it's lucky you did. I might have put things a good deal more plainly to him, with extremely awkward results, if you hadn't dinned it into me so hard." "Well," Alec said slowly, "what are you going to do about it, now you've presumably got at the truth at last?" "Do about it? Forget it, of course. I told you my views just now, and I said the man who killed Stanworth ought to be acclaimed as a public benefactor. As that is unfortunately out of the question, the next best thing is to forget as diligently as possible that Stanworth did not, after all, shoot himself, as everybody else believes." Said Alec, gazing out of the window. "I wonder, you're really sure of that?" "Absolutely," said Roger with decision. "Anything else would be ludicrous under the circumstances. We won't discuss that side of it again." There was a little pause. The second woman," Alec said tentatively. "How were you able to identify her so positively?" Roger drew the envelope out of his breast pocket, opened it, and carefully extracted the hair. He laid it across his knee for the moment and contemplated it in silence. Then, with a sudden movement, he picked it up and threw it through the open window. "There goes a vital piece of evidence," he said with a smile. "Well, for one thing, there was nobody else in the house with just that particular shade of hair, was there?" "I suppose not," Alec replied. There was another silence, rather longer this time. Then Roger, glancing curiously across at his companion, remarked very airily, "Just to satisfy my natural curiosity, Alec, why exactly did you kill Stanworth?" End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Layton Court Mystery by Anthony Berkeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Erickson, Toronto. Chapter 28. What really did happen? Alec contemplated the tips of his shoes for a moment. Then he looked up suddenly. "It wasn't exactly murder, you know," he said abruptly. "Certainly not," Roger agreed. "It was a well-merited execution." "No, I don't mean that. I mean, if I hadn't killed Stanworth, he would probably have killed me. It was partly self-defense. I'll tell you the whole story in a minute." "Yes, I should like to hear what really happened. That is, if you feel yourself at liberty to tell me, of course. I don't want to force confidences about the second lady in the case." "About Barbara? Oh, there's nothing that reflects on her, and I think you ought to hear the truth. I always meant to tell you the whole thing if you found out that I did it, and of course if you were intending to take any drastic step, such as telling the police or trying to get Jefferson arrested. That's why I made you promise to tell me before you did anything like that." "Quite so," Roger nodded understandingly. "A good many things are plain to me now. Why you hung back so much and were so unenthusiastic, and threw cold water on everything and pretended to be so dull, and refused to believe that a murder had been committed at all, although I'd proved it to you beyond any shadow of doubt." "I was trying to keep you off the right track all the time. I really never thought you'd find out." "Perhaps I shouldn't have done if the significance of that hair hadn't dawned on me at last. After that, everything seemed to come in a series of flashes. Even then I might not have hit on the truth with such certainty if two particular photographs hadn't suddenly developed themselves in my mind." "Tell me all your side of it, then I'll tell you mine." "Very well. As I said, that hair was the clue to the whole thing. I'd taken it quite idly out of my pocket out there in the garden and was having a look at it, when it suddenly struck me that whosoever it might be, it was certainly not one of Mrs. Plant's. I stared at it hard enough then, I can tell you, and the second realization occurred to me that, from the color at any rate, it looked uncommonly like one of Barbara's. Then the first of the pictures flashed across my mind. It was of Graves sorting the post just before lunch yesterday. He had only 3 letters, and they were all of exactly the same appearance, same shaped envelopes, and typewritten addresses. One was for Mrs. Plant, one for Jefferson, and one for Barbara. The first 2 I'd already accounted for, now I seemed to be accounting for the third. Add to all that Barbara's ill-concealed agitation the next morning, and the fact that, for no apparent cause whatever, she broke off her engagement to you at the same time, and the thing was as plain as daylight. Barbara was also in the library that night, and for some reason or other the poor kid had got into Stanworth's clutches. "She hadn't," Alec put in. "It was—" "All right, Alec, you can tell me all that in the proper place. Let me finish my story first. Well, having got so far, of course, I ask myself, what light does this throw on Stanworth's death? Does it give a definite pointer to any person? The answer was obvious: Mr. Alexander Grierson. I gasped at first, I can assure you, but when I got rather more used to the idea, daylight simply flooded in. First of all, there was your hanging back all the time. That began to take on a very significant aspect. Then there was your height and your strength, which fitted in very nicely, and I knew that your place in Worcestershire, where you must have spent most of your boyhood, is liberally supplied with lattice windows, so that you might be expected to be up to all the tricks of the trade regarding them. So far, in fact, so good. But what about that footprint? I thought I'd managed that rather neatly. By Jove, I remember the shock you gave me when you discovered that, and the way I got out of the library that night. I'd thought that was absolutely untraceable." "Yes, that did give me an awkward couple of minutes, until I remembered that you'd run back to get your pipe while I was talking to the chauffeur, and that's where the second of my little pictures comes in. The scene flashed across my mind on that flower bed just after you had stepped onto the path when we were trying to find out who had been in the library, and before you smoothed out the fresh footprints you'd made. The old and the new prints were absolutely identical, you see. I suppose I must have noted it subconsciously at the time without realizing its significance." "I noticed it all right," Alec said grimly. "It gave me a bad turn for the moment." "After that, all sorts of little things occurred to me," Roger continued. "I began to test each of the facts I'd collected, and in each case the explanation was now obvious. Those letters, for instance, I knew they must have been posted between 5 and 8:30 that morning, and at 8 o'clock behold you coming back from the village, and actually saying you'd been down there to post a letter." "Couldn't think of any other explanation on the spur of the moment." Alec grinned ruefully. "Yes, and curiously enough, I questioned the bookmaker motif at the time, didn't I? Then there was your quite genuine anxiety to stop me from assuming complicity on the part of Mrs. Plant. I suppose you knew all the time about her and Stanworth, didn't you?" Alec nodded. "I was present at the interview between them," he said briefly. "The devil you were!" Roger exclaimed in surprise. "I never gathered that. She didn't say anything about it." "She didn't know. I'll tell you all about that. Anything else on your side?" Roger considered. "No, I don't think so. I gathered that you had somehow got to know that Stanworth was blackmailing Barbara, and had simply waded in and shot him as any other decent chap would have done in your place. That's the gist of it." "Well," Alex said slowly, "there's a little more in it than that. I'd better begin right at the beginning, I think. As you know, Barbara and I had got engaged that afternoon. Well, I suppose you can imagine that a thing like that rather unsettles a chap. Anyhow, the upshot was that when I got to bed that night, I found I couldn't sleep. I tried for some time, and then I gave it up as hopeless and looked around the room for a book. There was nothing I particularly wanted to read there, so I thought I'd slip down to the library and get one. Of course, I had no idea that everyone wouldn't be in bed, so I didn't trouble to put on a dressing gown, but just went down as I was, in pajamas. There were no lights on the landing or in the hall, but to my surprise, when I got there, I found all the lights in the library full on. However, there wasn't anyone inside, and the door was open, so I went in and began to look round the shelves. Then I heard unmistakably feminine footsteps approaching, and hardly wishing to be caught like that, I nipped behind those thick curtains in front of the sash window and sat down on the seat to wait till the person, whoever it might be, had gone. I thought it was someone come down like me for a book, and probably also more or less in a state of undress. Not that I really thought much about it at all. I just didn't want to be mixed up in a rather embarrassing situation. "Quite natural," Roger murmured. "Yes?" Through the chink in the curtains I could see that it was Mrs. Plant. She was still in evening dress, and I saw at once that she looked rather worried. Very worried, in fact. She began to wander aimlessly about the room, twisting her handkerchief about in her hands, and it looked rather as if she'd been crying. Then Stanworth came in. "Ah," Alec hesitated. "I don't want to exaggerate or turn on the pathetic tap too much," he resumed a little awkwardly, "but I hope to God I never have to see anything again like the scene that followed. Roger, it was almost unbearable. I don't know how I sat it out without dashing through the curtains and getting my hands into Stanworth's throat, but I had the sense to see that anything like that would only make matters very much worse. Have you ever seen a woman in agony? My God, it was absolutely heartrending. I could never have imagined that a man could be such an indescribable brute." He paused, shivering slightly, and Roger watched him sympathetically. He was beginning to realize just how terrible that scene must have been, if it could move the stoical Alec to such a display of emotion. "You know the main lines of what happened, don't you?" Alec went on, rather more calmly. "So I needn't go into details. The wretched woman begged and wept, but it had no more effect upon Stanworth than if he had been a stone image. He just went on smiling that infernal, cynical smile and told her not to make such an unnecessary fuss. Then he made that suggestion to her that you told me about, and for the moment I very nearly saw red. As for her, it finished her off completely. She just crumpled up on the Chesterfield and didn't say another word. A few minutes later, she got up and tottered out of the room. Then I came out of my hiding place." "Good man," Roger murmured. "Well, of course I knew by this time just how the land lay. I knew what Stanworth was, and I knew where he kept his evidence against these people. I didn't quite know what I was going to do, but it was pretty clear that something had got to be done. Well, he was a bit startled at first, but recovered himself wonderfully, and began to be infernally sarcastic and cynical. I told him that I wasn't going to stand the sort of thing I'd just seen, and unless he stopped the whole thing and let me burn all the evidence he'd been talking about, I'd go straight to the police and tell them all about it. That seemed to amuse him quite a lot, and he pointed out that if I did that, everything would come to light which all these people had been paying money to keep concealed, and they'd all be very much worse off than before. That had never occurred to me, and I was rather taken aback for the minute. Then I told him that if that was the case, I'd unlock the safe myself, even if I had to lay him out to get the key. He simply laughed and tossed his keys on the table. "That's the one for the safe," he said. "I don't quite know how you're going to open it, as you happen to be ignorant of the combination, but doubtless you have provided for that contingency." Of course, that took me in the wind again, but before I could answer him, I heard somebody coming down the stairs. "Ah," he said, "I was quite forgetting. I've got another visitor coming to see me tonight. As you seem to have mixed yourself up in my affairs, the least I can do is to invite you to be present at this interview also. Get behind that curtain again, and I think I can promise you an interesting quarter of an hour." Well, I hesitated while the footsteps began to cross the hall, till he caught me by the arm and sort of snarled, "Get out of sight, you fool. Can't you see you'll make it 10 times worse for her by letting her see you?" Even then I didn't realize what he meant, but I saw that there was something in what he said, and just managed to get behind the curtain in time. You can imagine what I felt like when the door opened and I saw Barbara come into the room. "Ghastly!" Roger exclaimed with feeling. "Ghastly? That's putting it mildly. Well, I'm not going to tell you the details of what happened then, because there's really no need to, and it's only giving people away unnecessarily. All I need say is that Stanworth had got hold of some information about Mrs. Shannon. I don't even know what it was. He ostentatiously pulled a revolver out of his desk, opened the safe, and showed her 2 or 3 pieces of paper, holding them so that she could read them without taking them into her hands. Then he told her to sit down on the settee to talk things over, keeping the revolver in front of him on the desk all the time. Well, Barbara sat down, looking very white and frightened, poor kid, but still not knowing in the least what Stanworth was getting at. He didn't keep her in ignorance long. He just leaned back in his chair, informed her calmly that if she didn't fall in with his wishes, he'd make the information he'd just shown her public property, and calmly proceeded to state his terms. Lord, Roger, old man, I had some difficulty in holding myself in. What do you think he wanted? He told her absolutely plainly that what he was after was money, and went on to say that he knew quite well that she herself hadn't got enough to satisfy him. Therefore, she'd got to marry me within a month, so that she would be able to pay the very moderate sums which he would from time to time require. She could either tell me or not, as she saw fit. It didn't matter to him in the least. If she refused, he was very much afraid she and her mother would have to take the consequences. Of course, you see what he was getting at. Me. He was practically saying to me that if I didn't marry her and pay his blackmail, he would disgrace and ruin the mother of the girl I loved. Very neat sort of trap, wasn't it? Incidentally, he went on to point out, also for my benefit, that it wasn't the least use trying to do him any sort of bodily harm, because that would only bring things to a head in the way you know, and he never opened the safe without a loaded revolver in his hand, which he wouldn't hesitate for a second to use if it became necessary. Well, Barbara behaved like an absolute thoroughbred. In fact, she told him in so many words to go to the devil. She wouldn't dream of involving me in the affair, and as for her and her mother, they'd have to take what was coming to them if he chose to behave in such a damnable way, but they'd take it alone. Great Scott, she was wonderful. She practically defied him to do his worst, and said that she was going to break off her engagement to me the very next morning. Then she sailed out of the room with her head in the air, leaving him sitting there. No tears, no entreaties, simply the most overwhelming contempt. Roger, she was just marvelous. "I can believe you," Roger said simply. "What happened then?" "I came out again. I think I meant to kill Stanworth then if I got a chance to do so without making a worse mess of things. Remember, I knew already to what lengths he was ready to push the wretched women that he had in his clutches, and though Barbara would certainly never give way to him an inch, I wasn't so sure about Mrs. Shannon. Well, there was the safe still open, and there was Stanworth sitting in his chair with a revolver in his hand. He looked at me with a grin as I appeared and said he hoped I hadn't been too bored. I walked straight up to him without a word. I was beyond talking by then. and I suppose he could see from my face what I had in mind. Anyhow, when I was only a few feet away, he whipped up the revolver and fired. Luckily, he missed, and I heard the vase shatter behind me. I lunged forward, grabbed his wrist, and used all my strength to twist it round till the muzzle was pointing straight at his own forehead. Then I simply tightened my finger over his on the trigger and shot him. I didn't stop to think what I was doing or anything like that. I hardly imagine I was capable of thought at the moment. I just knew that Stanworth had got to be killed in the same way that one knows that a mad dog or a rat or any other vermin has got to be killed. In fact, once he was dead, I hardly paid any more attention to him at all. He was a filthy thing wiped out, and that's all there was about it. I never felt, nor have felt since, a single moment's compunction. I suppose it's curious in a way. "You'd have been a sentimental fool if you had," Roger said with decision. "Well, I suppose I'm not a sentimental fool, then," Alec replied with a slight smile, "for I most certainly haven't. Well, as soon as the man was dead, I became as cool as ice. I knew exactly, almost without thinking about it, what had got to be done. First of all, and in case I was interrupted, the evidence in the safe had got to be destroyed, and then I had to make my escape. It didn't take long to burn the documents in the safe. There was one shelf full of them, all done up in envelopes inscribed with various addresses, about 16 or 17 altogether, I suppose. I burnt them in the hearth without opening them, and just ran through the contents of the other shelves to make sure that I hadn't missed anything. Up till then, mind, it had never occurred to me that the case would ever appear to be anything but murder, and if it was traced back to me, I should simply say that I had shot him in self-defense, after he had first shot at me. I would have gone to the police straight away and told them the whole thing, if it wasn't that that would have given away the facts of blackmail, which it was of course essential to hush up. Then I glanced at the chair in which he was lying, and it struck me that he looked exactly as if he had shot himself, so I began to wonder if I couldn't make the whole thing look like suicide. "I knew you weren't such a blithering fool as you've been trying to make yourself out to be for the last 48 hours. Roger interjected. "Yes?" "Well, the whole finished effect didn't occur to me at once. I started off by shutting the safe and putting the keys back in his waistcoat pocket. The wrong pocket, as it turned out afterwards. Then I cleared up the bits of vase and shoved them into my pocket for the time being, and examined the revolver in Stanworth's hand. To my joy, I found that I could get at the chamber and extract the first shell without loosening his grip, which I proceeded to do. You were right about my knowledge of lattice windows. I knew that trick with the handle when I was a boy, and patted myself on the back when I realized how I could get out of the room and leave everything locked behind me. Lord, I never thought anyone would spot that." "You weren't reckoning for me to be on the trail, my boy," Roger said with modest pride. "Well, you certainly made me jump when you discovered it. Let's see now, what did I do next? Oh yes, the letters. I knew that all these people would be scared to death at the idea of Stanworth having shot himself with the safe still locked, as even if they had the keys, nobody could open it without the combination, and I thought that, in the agitation of the moment, Mrs. Plant or somebody might give some vital point away. So I sat down and hammered out letters to the 3 of them on the typewriter, for I knew by what I'd seen in the safe that both Jefferson and Lady Stanworth were involved in it also. You know what I said in the letters, of course. Well, then I had a final look round, and just by chance thought I'd better glance into the wastepaper basket. The very first thing I saw there was a sheet of paper, only very slightly crumpled, that bore Stanworth's signature. Instantly I thought to myself, why not rig up a statement of suicide just to clinch things? And I typed one out above the signature. Of course all this took a devil of a time. In fact, it was about 4 o'clock by now. I'd been as cool as a cucumber for 2 hours, but I was getting so tired that I made 1 or 2 mistakes after that. I never searched the wastepaper basket, for instance, and so left that other piece of paper with the signature there for you to find. And I forgot to smooth over that footprint on the bed. I did curse myself for that when you found it. Also, I ought not to have thrown those bits of vase into the shrubbery between the library and the dining room, I suppose. "But how did you get back into the house?" Roger asked. "Oh, before I locked up the library, I went through and opened the dining room windows. Then I just walked round from the lattice window and in through the dining room, locked the dining room door, and went up to bed. And that's all." "And very nicely timed," Roger remarked, glancing out of the window. "We shall be at Victoria in 5 minutes. Well, thanks very much for telling me like that, Alec. And now let us proceed madly to forget all about it, shall we?" "There's one thing that's been worrying me rather," Alec said slowly. "Do you think I ought to tell Barbara?" "Good heavens above, no!" Roger shouted, staring at his companion in dismay. "What on earth would you want to tell her for? She'd only be overcome with shame that you know anything about her mother's shortcomings, and the fact that you'd killed a man more or less on account of her would simply make her wretchedly miserable. Of course you mustn't dream of telling her, you goop." "I think you're probably right," Alec said, gazing out of the window. The train began to slacken speed, and the long, snaky Victoria platforms appeared in sight. Roger stood up and began to lift his suitcase off the rack. "I think we might stay up in town this evening and do a dinner and a show, don't you?" he said cheerfully. "I feel as if I want a little relaxation after my strenuous mental efforts of the last 2 days." Something seemed to be troubling Alec. "You know," he said awkwardly, "somehow I can't help wondering, are you really sure, Roger, that it wouldn't be best for me to go and tell the police? I mean, it isn't as if they'd have me up for a murder or anything like that. Nothing worse than manslaughter, I should imagine. And I dare say I should get off altogether on the self-defense idea. But are you sure it isn't really the right thing to do?" Roger gazed down at his companion with disfavor. "For heaven's sake, Alec, do try sometimes not to be so disgustingly conventional," he said scornfully. The end. End of chapter 28. End of the Layton Court mystery by Anthony Berkeley.